Good evening. Thank you very much for tuning in to our 8th debate of term. Shakespeare is quite possibly the most widely read author ever. He can be understood to be the greatest literary genius England and perhaps the world has produced. He also constitutes a fundamental component of the English literature course here in Cambridge and research here in Cambridge, and indeed similar courses across the country. But is all the hype really worth it? On this call tonight to discuss the issue, we have 4 eminent guest speakers and 2 student speakers who have won their slots through open audition. There has been much engagement with this event on social media, so I hope plenty of you will get involved by sending in any questions or points of information in response to the speeches you hear tonight. You can do this by following the link in the description below. Now, without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker for the proposition tonight on the motion, "This House believes the hype around Shakespeare is much ado about nothing." Professor Michael Dobson is our first speaker. He is Director of the Shakespeare Institute, Professor of Shakespeare Studies at the University of Birmingham, and an Honorary Governor of the Royal Shakespeare Company. His research interests include how Shakespeare's work has inspired others. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And ladies, gentlemen, and non-binarists, and this being a Shakespeare debate, I hope that includes numerous young gentlemen dressed as ladies, dressed as gentlemen. It was perhaps a little eccentric of the organisers of this debate to invite Ben Crystal and myself, both of us notoriously enthusiastic about the works of Shakespeare, to speak in favour of tonight's proposition. And this with no option of our choosing the other side instead, and without even the whiff of a fee. But given the quality of the audience involved, the opportunity not to come to Cambridge in order not to have a nice dinner was of course too good to miss. And in any case, I can assure you that our contempt for the hype around Shakespeare is as profound as anyone's. Now, because we are fortunate enough to live in a country blessed with a national education system, we all know the hype around Shakespeare. But before my learned coadjutors take their turns to speak, I want to remind you of a few salient points. William Shakespeare is a central part of England's national heritage. In his puffy sleeves and puffier breeches, this great Briton, reverently called the Bard, is as much a proud symbol of our country as our beefeaters and Morris dancers. A true native son of the provincial Warwickshire soil, Shakespeare was born into a Renaissance golden age of illiteracy and squalor. He lived his life among cottages, plague pits, and the unassuming bear-baiting arenas amongst which our ancestors laid the first foundations of our national tastes for reality television and rugby football. Since Shakespeare's plays were manifestly destined to become keystones of the national curriculum, as all the states-appointed purveyors of hype agree, he composed them with a number of learning outcomes in mind. He wrote them largely in poetry in order to provide comprehension exercises for use in school examinations. He wrote about people in order to supply clues about his life and opinions for the benefit of future biographers, whose well-hyped books now enable readers to celebrate this exemplary figure while avoiding his works altogether. And in his histories, Shakespeare wrote about his homeland in order to celebrate the glamorous, unending pageant that is the English monarchy. In the process of achieving these outcomes, the hype tells us, Shakespeare also sought to provide a timeless fund of quotable, condensed, almost Yoda-like universal wisdom. And he set out to remind future ages how reprehensibly wrong all the Elizabethans were about almost everything. Shakespeare has been much helped in this last endeavour by our leading academic publishers, such as, for example, Cambridge University Press. Their not quite identical reprints pad out their discussions of the exciting obscure misprints in the earliest editions by giving back to the plays, in ever longer footnotes and appendices, all the pub quiz factual trivia about the 1590s and the 1600s, and all the boring bits in the source materials which Shakespeare deliberately left out. Similar instructive endeavours, meanwhile, have enabled the much-hyped construction in London of a quaint half-timbered museum shaped vaguely like an Elizabethan playhouse, Shakespeare's Globe. Here, tourists and children, if they have to encounter the plays at all, can hear them being shouted merrily by actors wearing recreated clothing of Shakespeare's period in all its safe, authentic silliness. For Shakespeare, as all the mighty official hype I have sketched unanimously declares, is history. Whether one views Tudor and Stuart England as glorious or as criminally misguided, William Shakespeare, our national poet, ye oldie bard of Avon, is endlessly invoked as its prime symptom, exemplar, and spokesperson. The epicenter of all this hype is perhaps Shakespeare's irrelevant birthplace in Stratford, a treasured national asset which for 400 years has been setting the standard for obsolete and mediocre British domestic architecture. You exit through the gift shop, where you can buy a little bald bardic souvenir Shakespeare action figurine with mandatory puffy breeches and fully detachable plastic quill pen. Now such, I fear, is the hype around Shakespeare, and to call it much ado about nothing would be to put it very politely indeed. For this hype is at best inadequate and at worst pernicious. A bard, really, is a writer who claims to embody the entire indigenous folk tradition of the people, the sort of writer generally to be found on a monument, posing with a harp, as if saying, "Look at me being a bard. This epic is all about me. I'm a patriotic hero, you know." But half the point of Shakespeare's plays is that they aren't about Shakespeare, or his life, or his opinions, or his times. His characters come onto the stage not to preach or to advertise on behalf of a celebrity author, but to be themselves, to argue their own different corners and change each other and love and live and die. There is no universal editorializing systemic wisdom in Shakespeare's plays, just an incredible range of different things different people might do and say in different circumstances. Each phrase, however miraculous and unforgettable, is soon contradicted by another. So the Shakespeare of all those biographies is beside the point. And while there are excellent reasons for visiting Stratford, to see performances by the Royal Shakespeare Company or to study at the Shakespeare Institute, the wooden beams and the embarrassingly costumed guides will tell you nothing that will really enhance your imaginative participation in the plays and poems. Shakespeare did not waste his time writing memoirs about the Midlands or scripting educational documentaries about the local customs and beliefs of Elizabethan London. His writings shun antiquarianism and pedantry to such an extent that there isn't a single date in any of them. Nor was Shakespeare a nationalist, however the modern British state may have tried posthumously to co-opt him as such. Nothing in the plays or poems looks remotely like the first draft for the national anthem, and they generally depict the English royal family as a source of dissent, succession crises, and civil wars. So, no change there. Now, don't get us wrong on this side of the motion. It isn't that the plays don't deserve to be endlessly celebrated and publicised. They're the lifeblood of modern world drama, often even fresher in translation than they are in English. They're alive and well far beyond these small islands and their souvenir shops and schoolrooms. They're recognised worldwide as among the most intelligent, versatile, empathetic, dreamlike, generative, and searching pieces of popular live entertainment yet composed. But because that isn't how they are ever represented by the vast official hype around their author, which I have described, and which I know you will recognise, I ask you tonight to join us in throwing away the twee plastic doublet and hose figurine and in scorning the utilitarian platitudes of the national curriculum. vindicate the transformative ahistorical energies of the plays and poems, reject all this compulsory nationalist cant about the bard. Vote with us as we declare that the hype around Shakespeare is much ado about nothing.
Thank you very, very much, Michael, for your speech, which was, as it should be, very theatrical and much appreciated. We don't have any questions for you at the moment, so we will move on to our first speaker for the proposition tonight, Timothy West. Timothy is an English presenter, stage and television actor. As well as many classical theatre performances, he has appeared frequently on television, including spells in both Coronation Street and EastEnders. Most importantly, Timothy was also a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company. He has played Macbeth twice and King Lear 4 times. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Company, I wasn't grand enough for that, but maybe one day. Yes. Yes, well, what's it called? Much Ado About Nothing. Well, perhaps the debate ought to be entitled The Most Lamentable Tragedy of the Contention of Two Famous Houses, and that Love's Labour's loss will inevitably be lost. I don't know. Let's hope that all's well that ends well. Anyway, Shakespeare had 3 children, 2 of whom, daughters, lived till late middle age. And yet, in his plays, we find very few illustrations of domestic family life. And those examples that we do find are hardly encouraging. I mean, Hamlet and his mother, Lear and his daughters, the Capulet family, Florizel and Perdita don't even know who they are until the end of the play. No, it's only in Henry IV, in its 2 parts, that we are confronted with the complicated father-son paradigm that has declared the play to be the greatest work of literature in all English language. That's true. King Henry despairs of his son Hal, comparing his filial qualities unfavourably with the rebel leader Harry Hotspur, while Hal, estranged from his true parent, feels more comfortable with the attractive dissipation of his father substitute, Sir John Falstaff. The central character in this chronicle, really, is England herself. And the story is of the struggle, geographical, material, and spiritual, for her possession. Shakespeare reveals to us a rich panorama of English life: the court, the barons, the country gentlemen, the travellers, the townsfolk, the tavern dwellers, everybody, all caught up in the national turmoil as the guilt-ridden Henry IV is striving to put down the rebellion organised by the very people who helped him up in the first place, while at the same time fearing for the future of the kingdom in the hands of his wastrel son. Who is Falstaff? The great boar's head scenes in Part 1 have a comic energy unsurpassed by anything in Shakespeare. And of course, audiences need to love him and be sad at his final inevitable downfall. However, his unscrupulous sacrifice of his tattered recruits, allowing them to be cut to pieces for his own personal profit, is by no means comic. It is simply another example of the vicious self-interest that to some extent motivates nearly everyone in the play. The fact that he's been allowed to get away with things for so long suggests that there is some old-school tie, tattered and beer-stained now, which has won him some sort of indulgence. In Part 2 of the play, the partnership breaks down. Falstaff has always provided entertainment and excitement for Hal, for which he's paid in food, drink, and protection. But in Part 2, he fails to fulfill his side of the contract. He's letting his anxiety about the future show through. His jokes are less funny, his trickery a little more laboured, he's given way to a sense of resentment and melancholy. He feels Hal is growing away from him, and the old magic is not really there to draw him back. Throughout part two, there is a distinct feeling of aging, of bloodlessness, of a general running down that makes the play very difficult to follow, I think, for some people and for directors very often. Shakespeare must have seen this danger when he decided to introduce halfway through the play one of his most attractive and entertaining characters, the aged Justice Robert Shallow. Now, beneath their gentle comedy, these autumnal Gloucestershire scenes have a sad, elegiac quality, a sense of life coming to an end. Even the imagery employed by Falstaff in describing Shallow, a man made after supper of a cheese paring, for all the world like a forked radish, is drawn from the end of a meal. In part two, the king is tired. In fact, he's nearing death. The rebels are tired too. No longer is there a sanguine, heroic Hotspur to lead them into battle, no warlike Douglas or potent Glendower to lend their forces, only a group of dry political malcontents, Hastings, Mowbray, the Archbishop of York. Their very defeat is accomplished not by glorious triumph of arms, but by a despicable piece of treachery. Hal himself is somehow less of a person in part two, in retreat from his former self, but yet not yet the assured young ruler that we see in Henry V. The two plays need to be seen one after the other, ideally on a single day, because part two on its own can, as we know, be tiresome. I'm afraid we have to admit that Shakespeare was by way of being a conservative. Throughout his work, and particularly in the 9 historical plays, he is very clear about the loyalty and obedience to authority that should guarantee our safety and our well-being as individuals. We knew how things should be from an Elizabethan standpoint. Our urgent need was for political stability guaranteed by an undisputed monarchy. So did rich monarchy perform well? Well, sometimes they didn't. Richard III didn't. From the very start of Shakespeare's play, we observe the antagonism between the story's two opponents, Richard and Bolingbroke. The more Richard seeks to ridicule his rival's arguments for possession of the crown, the more self-righteous and narcissistic he appears, and the less effort Bolingbroke needs to employ to unseat him. Richard, coming back home after his visit to Ireland, makes a long emotional appeal to his followers, which I'm going to tell you, that fails to endear him to the other characters of the drama, but nor do I believe it endears him to the drama, to the audience themselves. I don't know about that. Here it is. I weep for joy to stand upon my kingdom once again. Dear earth, I do salute thee with my hand. Sorry, to see. Through the rebels wound thee with their horses' hooves. As a long-parted mother with her child plays fondly with her tears and smiles in meeting, so weeping, smiling, greet I thee, my earth, and do these favours with my royal hands. Feed not thy sovereign's foe, my gentle earth, nor with thy sweet comfort his ravenous sense, but let thy spiders that suck up thy venom, and heavy-gated, say that again, if I can, heavy-gated toads, yes, lie in their way, doing annoyance to his treacherous feet, which with usurping steps do trample thee. Yield stinging nettles to mine enemies, and when they from thy bosom pluck a flower, guard it, I pray, with the lurking adder, whose double tongue may with a mortal touch throw death upon thy sovereign's enemies. Yeah, Bolingbroke has a very different voice. Before the end of the play, it is obvious, however much we condole with the existing monarch, who is going to get the job of satisfying the proletariat. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Timothy, for your speech. We will now move on to our second speaker for the proposition tonight, Ben Crystal. Ben is an English actor, author and producer. He has co-written books on Shakespeare's life and writing style with his father, David Crystal. Ben's first solo book, Shakespeare on Toast, Getting a Taste for the Bard, was shortlisted for the 2010 Educational Writer of the Year Award. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My esteemed colleague Michael makes the point so well I hardly need continue, but I feel it is worth noting that while the motion this house believes that the hype around Shakespeare is much ado about nothing, while it might sound negative, if we delve deeper, it is actually very positive, that nothing is in fact everything. My father, the linguist Professor David Crystal, has helped me in this vein with his work in original pronunciation, a recreation of the accent spoken by Shakespeare and his fellows 400 years ago. Dad's work highlights that the word nothing could also be pronounced noting. Noting. Noting to the Elizabethans meant eavesdropping or overhearing, a dramatic device that takes place throughout the canon, from Romeo and Juliet to Measure for Measure or Measure for Measure, to Winter's Tale, and throughout Much Ado itself, of course. Shakespeare's works are indeed much ado about Norton. Noting also meant noting down. And Shakespeare is absolutely a great source, much ado about noting. My colleagues and I at the Shakespeare Ensemble take great geeky delight in noting the text details that Shakespeare filled his works with. Do audiences note, as Professor René Weiss pointed out, that Juliet, from the moment she wakes in the tomb next to her dead lover, to a few minutes later, when she plunges the dagger into herself, that she speaks 12 1/2 lines, one for each year of her life? Probably not. Do actors note such things, and do these things inform their performances? Absolutely. The hype around Shakespeare is indeed much ado about noting. Now, when I was young, Shakespeare was indeed much ado about nothing to me. I disliked his works and studying them immensely. I studied King Lear, and it was not until I performed in King Lear a few years later that I fell in love with the play, and it became my favourite in the canon. A simple line from the first scene in King Lear got me. Nothing will come of nothing. And it is a reminder of the journey I have been on with Shakespeare, from hate to love. It is a reminder as a self-employed creative. Nothing will come of nothing. To get out of bed every morning and create. And, like so many of his seemingly simple lines, to be or not to be comes to mind. Dramaturgically, the line notes a switch of gear from the testimonies of love of Cordelia's sisters to a moment of truth that then devolves into chaos, war, and heartbreak. As Sir Jonathan Miller once pointed out to me, taking hold of my arm in great delight in Primrose Hill one sunny afternoon in London, nothing will come of nothing is also a line that speaks to Shakespeare's refute to creationism. Of course, the orthodoxy of the day was that Lear, in saying nothing will come of nothing, is quite wrong. Everyone knew that in the creation of the universe, something was brought out of nothing. Cordelia might have made that point and changed the course of the play. Nothing is a true testament to the reason as to why hype has grown around this actor turned playwright. And so, I have "Nothing will come of nothing" tattooed here on my arm. It is written in my father's handwriting, my grandmother's handwriting, and my mother's handwriting, so it is also a reminder that I will always have them with me. The only signature that is missing is Shakespeare's. And if that won't convince you, nothing else will. So, I'm sure you all will agree that this is a totally undeniable proposition, that Shakespeare is indeed much ado about nothing, to which I'm sure our esteemed other side will not be able to counter in any convincing way. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ben, for that moving speech. We shall now move on to our fourth speaker for tonight, Dame Marina Warner. Marina is a writer of fiction, criticism and history. She is Professor of English and Creative Writing at Birkbeck University of London and the President of the Royal Society of Literature. She was the winner of the 2015 Holberg Prize and gave the BBC's Reith Lectures in 1994. Marina, the virtual floor is yours. Sorry, you'll need to unmute.
Thank you very much. Towards the close of Cymbeline, after the long sequence of misadventures and misunderstandings that have befallen her, the heroine Imogen is found by her father and her estranged husband. It's a classic recognition scene, but unusual because she's still successfully disguised as a boy. And it's her voice that's recognized, her way of talking. Or rather, not exactly talking, but ranting and railing. "Oh, get thee from my sight, thou gavest me poison, dangerous fellow, hence." Hearing this, her father Cymbeline the king exclaims in joy and wonder, "The tune of Imogen." When I have seen the play in performance, this remark, the tune of Imogen, inspires a widespread chuckle in the audience, as we recognize Imogen's spirit, not without a touch of misogynistic comedy about women's stridency. The tune of Imogen. Shakespeare heard his female characters with an ear that was tuned to listen intently to words and shapes of sentences, to the structures of discourse, the levels of meaning, and the real-life effects of speech. In opposing this motion, I want to present evidence that the voices in Shakespeare's works have formed an ethos that's a far more capacious language than the English he was writing in. That the accumulated responses over time of these overheard voices have built a world of experience, and that if we continue to inhabit it and move around in it, through reading and performing, watching theatre and viewing other media, those voices can stretch our understanding and enrich our own uses of language as a means of relating to others, of telling the truth in times of vicious deceptions, of helping us to see through hype. I'm not making the obvious points about vocabulary and the riches of Shakespeare's imagery, but about the multiple ways of persuasion that he dramatizes. The heroines all have their tune. Vala in Twelfth Night woos like a lover, and though she's playing a part, she sounds wholly sincere in her suit to Olivia on behalf of Orsino, when she cries, "Halloo your name to the reverberate hills, and make the babbling gossip of the air cry out, Olivia." Isabella in Measure for Measure hath prosperous art, when she will play with reason and discourse, and well she can persuade. She goes to Angelo, the Me Too villain, to sue for a pardon for her brother, and Angelo listens, but not for the right reasons. Portia in The Merchant of Venice presents a magnificent set piece of lofty forensic oratory. It's a formal public counterpart to Shylock's intensely felt apologia, "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" The witches babble fiendish doggerel and prophesy greatness to Macbeth, sowing the seed of his destruction, just as Iago's insinuations goad Othello to mad violence. Miranda greets the strangers shipwrecked on the island with the start of a hymn of praise. Goneril and Regan make wild protestations of ardent love, lying but convincing their father. Cordelia understands the deceptive force of words, and she says nothing, as we heard from Ben. She's silent. I'm emphasizing Shakespeare's female voices because women have traditionally been muted, or at least interdicted for speaking out and speaking up. However, in the interest of inclusivity, I'll now bring in Prince Hal. His repudiating Falstaff from the play that Timothy was talking about, when he says, "I know thee not, old man." This is also a performative speech act of the harshest kind. A sentence, indeed, a ban, a curse. These passages from Shakespeare embody the power of persuasive speech in multiple modes. At the risk of prosing away like Polonius to the player king, when he ticks off the different genres of plays, I'd like to point out that these tunes, these speeches, match conventional forms of rhetoric, which Shakespeare learned at the grammar school in Stratford: blazons, entreaties, elegies, encomia, apologia, charms, and invective and diatribe. Shakespeare deploys this full range of rhetoric across a vast range of topics, and in this way offers an inexhaustible arsenal to use in the contemporary world towards unmasking the deceits and manipulations of language and the purveyors of prejudice and racism. This is one of the reasons he's no longer simply William Shakespeare, an English player-writer of 400 years ago, but acts as the locus of continual debate and exploration in many languages and many media and production styles. But let's not leave with the idea that Shakespeare's uses of persuasion are all critical and analytic exposures and demolitions. He also shows us how language can wish people well, to quote Toni Morrison. He shows us the possible countermeasures, good spells, wise counsel. This is exemplified most vividly in a speech that survives from the unfinished play Sir Thomas More. More is confronting a mob baying for blood against foreigners. He asks them to imagine how they would feel if, for some reason, they too found themselves exiled. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs and their poor luggage, plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbour? Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth? What would you think to be used thus? It is a magnificent protest against mountainous inhumanity. And in its portrait of exclusion and prejudice, it's eerily prophetic of conditions today. Shakespeare's work reveals to us how men and women use language to persuade others, and we, listening to his characters, consequently understand the designs a speaker may have on us and penetrate the meaning. He is a supreme teacher of epistemic vigilance. The cultural wars of our time stage competing stories and discourses, and how convincingly they are conveyed matters more to their effect than what they say. Above all, it matters how we listen to them, how we understand and appraise them, and how we engage with them. We, you, urgently need to be better defended. I maintain Shakespeare gives us the means, the words, the tunes we need to understand what is being communicated and weigh judgment in response. Clever falsehoods and their harmful persuasions can be seen through, evaluated, resisted, and deflated.
Thank you very, very much, Marina, for your speech. It's now time to hear some students speak. So our third speaker for the proposition is Samuel Rubenstein. Sam is a second-year history student at Trinity College. He won this slot through open audition. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Freddie, and thanks to all of my predecessors for their fine speeches and to James and Kyoka for organising this debate. It's a delight to be with you all virtually tonight. Now, to argue successfully against a figure as universally revered as William Shakespeare will require a mighty intercession by St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, but I shall endeavour to do my best. Before embarking on a soliloquy, I begin, as is appropriate, with a quotation from the bard himself. In Henry IV, Part 1, the play which was soundly praised by the first speaker for the opposition, Shakespeare has Hotspur say, "Nay, I'll have a starling shall be taught to speak, nothing but Mortimer, and give it to him to keep his anger still in motion." The line itself is rather good, as most of Shakespeare's are. But a few centuries later, a very eccentric American named Eugene Schieffelin decided, bizarrely, to introduce all of the birds mentioned in the entire Shakespearean corpus to the United States. So in 1890, on the basis of this one line from Henry IV, Part 1, he released 60 European starlings into New York's Central Park. Today, they number over 200 million and are such a menace to American agriculture that they are unprotected under US law. In 1960, Eastern Airlines Flight 375 crashed on takeoff in Boston due to a bird strike by a large flock of starlings. They wouldn't have been in America were it not for Schieffelin's Shakespeare fetish. For the 62 men and women who died that day, and for the thousands of farmers whose livelihoods had been negatively impacted by European starlings, the hype around Shakespeare was worse than Much Ado About Nothing. It was lethal. Now, I'm drawing this peculiar anecdote to your attention, not solely to make a crude utilitarian point about how Shakespeare, or rather the hype around Shakespeare, has indirectly had some very negative consequences, but also because I think it's the perfect analogy for Shakespeare's dominance of the curriculum and the canon. Starlings are pugnacious, dense, greedy birds. They eat all the food and cause other birds to starve. The critical history of early modern literature is much the same. Shakespeare, the starling, gets all of the nutrition and attention at the expense of other deserving and equally talented early modern birds, as it were, like Ben Jonson, Thomas Middleton, and Sir Philip Sidney. And so we talk about the Shakespearean period as if such a thing ever existed. And the word Shakespeare, the name Shakespeare, is sometimes uncritically taken as a byword for early modern English literature as a whole. But in fact, Shakespeare was just one of many creative geniuses operating at around the same time in the same intellectual environment. He was not intrinsically any more remarkable than his contemporaries. So why is he the object of such grossly outsized, disproportionate fascination? What, in other words, is so special about William Shakespeare? Now, some argue that Shakespeare's genius resided in his capacity to innovate, but this is patently false. As has previously been said by the other side, Shakespeare was essentially conservative. All his plays were derivative of stories that already had prominent place in the common stock. He took Othello and Measure for Measure from Cincio, Romeo and Juliet from Arthur Brooke, Macbeth from Raphael Holinshed, Troilus and Cressida, of course, from Chaucer. And neither was he particularly creative in matters of genre, where he stuck very closely to the Aristotelian rulebook. His tragedies and comedies are rigorously formulaic. Now, that in itself is no bad thing, because, of course, the formula works wonderfully. But it does mean that his plays lack the excitement and the inventiveness of, say, Philip Sidney's genre-inventing Arcadia, which mixes poetry with drama and prose, and in which we can detect an early foretaste of the novel. It is also commonly said of Shakespeare that his greatness resided in his enrichment of the English language. I'm sure when many of you were at school, your English classrooms, and mine certainly had this, had that wretched poster with the Bernard Levin quotation that begins, "If you cannot understand my argument and declare it's Greek to me, you are quoting Shakespeare." Well, here we're talking more about etymology than we are about literature. And really, in that case, I think, and I submit that it ought to be William the Bastard who we put up on a pedestal, because nothing has contributed more to the fabric of our language than the Norman Conquest. And that's not to mention that many of Shakespeare's neologisms fail to catch on. So to paraphrase Bernard Levin, if in lockdown you've become quite quatch or foxship, if lockdown has made you sweltery or less sweltery, if you think the Conservative government is wappened, if you lovingly call your wife your kicky wicky, well, then you are quoting Shakespeare. He was not of an age, but for all time, Ben Jonson dramatically and famously wrote of Shakespeare. In some ways, of course, he was very much of his age, as all people are, and most notoriously, The Taming of the Shrew and The Merchant of Venice don't chime all too well with the present zeitgeist. Some of the themes in Shakespeare's plays are, of course, pertinent to our own times, but so are some of Jonson's. The Royal Shakespeare Company, which, by the way, is a very good example of Shakespeare being used as a byword for early modern, put on a production of Jonson's Volpone, his delightfully cynical subversion of the animal fable, a few weeks ago. Its messages about greed were as poignant and pertinent then, in the years after the global financial crisis, as they were at the beginning of the reign of James I. And Dame Marina touched on this, I think, when she referred to Angelo in Measure for Measure as a Me Too villain in much the same way. All art is both of its time and transcends it, and Shakespeare does not have a monopoly on that fact. And what about the pure aesthetic enjoyment and appreciation of drama? Here, of course, we enter the quicksand of subjectivity. Suffice it to say that I was not particularly enthused by endless performances of that ghastly play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, in primary school. And I was far less stimulated by devoting 2 whole years of my life to Othello in sixth form. The play that really got me excited about early modern literature was the criminally underappreciated and understudied Woman Beware Woman by Thomas Middleton. And what's not to love? It has an exquisitely fantastical story with chess, a bizarre incest subplot, and a brilliantly exciting ending in which everyone gets killed in very contrived and convoluted ways. I take that over 2 Gentlemen of Verona any day. If you give that to school pupils, I guarantee they won't put it down. So what remains of Shakespeare? He was, of course, a brilliant mind and a brilliant playwright, and nobody on my side of the aisle would dispute that. But he was a mortal man, and he was in no sense intrinsically better than his illustrious contemporaries. He was pretty ordinary. He played by the rules to great effect, but he was no radical innovator the way Sidney was, no more transcendent or profound than Jonson was, and none of his plays approached the greatness or sheer aesthetic quality or capacity to entertain, to my mind anyway, like Middleton does in Woman Beware Woman. So just as it is completely legal in America to remove starlings' nests because they're an oversized pest, so too, I think, should we dispense with some of Shakespeare's plays, cut him down to size, and make some room in the curriculum for his contemporaries, leaving some food, as it were, for the other hungry birds. Early modern English literature was a rich tapestry of which Shakespeare was only ever a part. So we should tone down the hype for Shakespeare and distribute it more evenly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your speech. From student to student, we shall now move on to our third speaker for the opposition, Lara Brown. Lara is a first-year English student at Downing College. She is also next term's debate officer here at the Union, where I hope she will continue the tradition of a literature debate. Lara won this slot through open audition. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Freddie, and thanks so much for Kyoka and James for putting on such a fascinating debate. When I've been thinking about the question of Shakespeare's hype, my thoughts have inevitably turned to what I think is one of the most interesting areas of scholarship surrounding Shakespeare. And that's the incredibly popular and extensive conspiracies claiming Shakespeare, the man as we know him, could not possibly have written such a wealthy collection of works. After this debate, please go on Wikipedia and take a quick scroll through the authorship tag of Shakespeare's section. Hundreds and hundreds of authors have been proposed in Shakespeare's name. People have butchered up the plays, trying to find genres and assign them to different people. And some have suggested that Shakespeare is simply the collective name for a conglomerate of writers. And of course they have. I think these claims are a real testament to the incredible diversity Shakespeare demonstrates in his hugely eclectic volumes of plays. The most popular theory, of course, is the Draconian Theory, which holds that we ought to credit Francis Bacon with the plays of the Bard. The theory goes that Francis Bacon was the real brains behind Shakespeare. He had to hide his own name from the publications for fear it would set his political career back. This is, of course, nonsense, as almost all modern scholars would agree. But a far more interesting question, I think, is where it rose to such prominence in the first place. And I think this is because, despite what you've heard from the opposition, Shakespeare doesn't at all fit the mould of the stock aristocratic literary figure that we're used to. Francis Bacon does. Bacon was born the son of a lord. He was educated at home and then at Trinity College, Cambridge, like all self-respecting members of the aristocracy. And he's exactly what we expect to see on the 16th century literary stage. His reverence for Aristotle was, of course, easily facilitated by the extensive education in classics, both Latin and Greek, an absolute given for anyone hoping for success at the time. Shakespeare, on the other hand, really couldn't be more unconventional. He was born into a middle-class family, the son of an alderman and a glove maker. His education was neither at home nor Eton. Instead, he went to a free grammar school, one that would have taught limited Latin grammar and absolutely no Greek. He was not university educated, and instead he got married at 18 and disappeared almost entirely off the London scene until around 1592. There is no money, no expensive education, and no political connections behind Shakespeare's initial success. He rose to fame as a middle-class boy from the Midlands simply because everyone absolutely adored his plays. Not just the aristocracy, not just his friends in the monarchy, everyone. In Shakespeare, we see a rare example of absolute meritocratic brilliance. Meritocratic brilliance that cannot be undeserving of the hype we've offered it. As I imagined he would, the Westminster and Cambridge-educated Ben Jonson has rightfully come up a lot in this debate. Writing at the same time as Shakespeare, in a very similar genre, and often regarded as the second most important playwright under James I, I think it is right that both sides of the aisle discuss how Shakespeare might differentiate himself from his contemporaries. So, why is it that we don't force every child of primary school age and beyond to watch and read Jonson's work? And I think the answer here is very simple. They aren't nearly as good. They've had a far more limited impact on the English language, and they just don't offer such an eclectic wealth of writing. Aside from two relatively disastrous tragedies, Jonson stuck firmly to one vein of comedy, relying on a tried and tested formula of plays he knew would appease a Jacobean audience. His plays are perfectly fine. In fact, they achieve a remarkable realism and a brilliant insight into early Renaissance life and custom. And yet, they just haven't had anything near the lasting impact on English literary history that Shakespeare has achieved. No one has ever suggested, as far as I'm aware, that Jonson couldn't possibly have written his own plays. He has all the privilege required to make success likely, and all his works are so similar that it's not at all surprising they're by the same person. In As You Like It, it is claimed that all the world's a stage, and all men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. And Shakespeare certainly played many parts. He wrote a diverse and mixed selection of plays that defy categorization and simplification. On the other hand, Jonson's writing is far more simple and far more firmly rooted in early Renaissance life. It has had its entrance, and it has then had its exit, and cannot and never will achieve the lofty bar set by Shakespeare. So why, despite all the reasons I've given you for some serious hype surrounding Shakespeare, is there such a strong apathy barrier? Why do only 54% of Britain's survey believe that Shakespeare has any relevance to today's world? And here, I think, as both sides have pointed out already, Shakespearean education is to blame. I will never forget trawling through the Merchant of Venice for 2 years at GCSE, being asked to translate various lines and memorizing facts about iambic pentameter. And I think, sadly, this is most people's introduction to the brilliant playwright. And this allows most people to easily dismiss the plays as a series of thys and thous which will never bear any relevance to them. And yet, having resolved to abandon Shakespeare entirely, having dismissed it as anachronistic or irrelevant, one might find that it's nearly impossible to actually escape his sphere of influence. Have you ever waited with bated breath for some news? Have you ever felt green-eyed with jealousy? Or have you ever been forced into a painful team-bonding exercise with your friends to break the ice? If so, then you've directly experienced the long-lasting ways in which Shakespeare's altered the way in which we perceive the world around us. And I'm not going to talk about just the 17,000 words he introduced to the English language. I want to talk about the ways he permanently altered the ways in which we perceive and interpret narrative, storytelling, and drama. Shakespeare wasn't the last person to invent words, but it's a technique that Sir Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser would never have used without the precedent set by Shakespeare. We wouldn't have Moby Dick if not for the framework offered in Hamlet. And we wouldn't have almost all the titles of Charles Dickens if he hadn't had Shakespeare. We would also almost certainly take an entirely different approach to romance. If it weren't for Shakespeare, the intermingling of tragedy and romance wouldn't be such a commonplace and beloved feature of modern narrative. I think that Shakespeare's unpopularity is broadly a consequence of our snobbish refusal to modernise the language. an approach that I'm relatively confident Shakespeare himself would have abhorred. It's telling that in countries where Shakespeare is taught in translation, he is perceived as far, far more relevant. And I think this lies in the fact that translation requires modernization in its word choice. It is often said that there are only 7 stories, and Shakespeare told them all brilliantly. As has been noted by the proposition, these weren't his stories. I think, though, this is a relatively unimaginative criticism. I implore you to find any author who worked from entirely original stories, who never borrowed or even stole from others. But what Shakespeare does that entirely sets him apart from others is ability to craft brilliant characters, characters that we still enjoy recreating today. We might think we don't love Shakespeare, but then we turn to Clueless, The Lion King, and Game of Thrones. And we must recognise that these are all a celebration of the timeless, multi-layered character that Shakespeare offered to the world. We must embrace these modernisations, preserving Shakespeare's incredible storytelling, his painful moral questions, and genius mastery of language. Shakespeare wrote for the masses, and we should teach Shakespeare in the same way. As has been quoted already, it was Shakespeare's biggest rival, Johnson, that noted that his work was not of an age, but for all time. And this couldn't be truer. I think any man who wrote words that we want to tattoo on our arms is certainly worthy of the hype. His plays allow us to interpret and appreciate events of any age in a way that must set Shakespeare aside from his contemporaries. And that's why I urge you to vote for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Lara, for your speech. We will now move on to our fourth speaker for the proposition, Paul Norris. Paul is an English graduate from Queen's College, and he is currently working as a pastor at Fisher House. You have our ears, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite a pastor yet, just a pastoral assistant. Well, I've been told throughout this debate that my internet connection is unstable. So if I miss any particularly great points from the other side, I have the excuse that they were occluded by the juddering of that connection. But I would like to respond to one point that has been mentioned quite a lot: the number of words and phrases that we owe to Shakespeare. And I'd just like to point out that could as equally be a product of the hype as a reason for it. The fact that we talk about Shakespeare so much means that a lot of the words and phrases that he used in his plays have entered our language. I want to make something clear. We, on side proposition, are not iconoclasts. We are not rabble-rousers, statue fellers, or radical graffiti artists with a mission to tear down old certainties, old commandments, or old canons. Frankly, I wish we were. I wish we were a bit more rebellious, a bit more bold, a bit less safe. If you wanted a 4-part image of the establishment, you couldn't do better than the 4 of us. I raise this only to say that if you're intending to vote for side opposition because you don't want to shake things up, I think you would be mistaken. I'm not saying there is an analogy between your choice tonight and certain political choices in the past, certain choices between patriotic cults of personality driven by a great deal of hype, and an alternative order that might seem, in comparison, less exciting, less dangerous, less emotionally charged, but which is perhaps more balanced, more sensible. I'm not saying there is an analogy, but if there was, I would say that our side does exhibit a concern for balance, rather than a high-stakes, winner-takes-all competitiveness, centered on a single figure. And this is precisely why we are not trying to topple Shakespeare's statue. Now that I am no longer an English student, I think I can say without fear of being instantly expelled that if we are doing anything, we are being true to the author's intentions. We come not to bury Shakespeare, but to praise him. Because it is balance that epitomizes Shakespeare's greatness, not excess, not spectacle, and certainly not hype. Hype doesn't sound like a Shakespearean word, and indeed it isn't. The term is a shortening of hyperbole, perhaps the least loved of all rhetorical figures. In Greek, the word means a throwing beyond, and in his rhetoric, Aristotle writes that there is something youthful about hyperboles, for they show vehemence, wherefore those who are in a passion most frequently make use of them. Close to Shakespeare's own time, the 16th century rhetorical theorist Henry Peacham describes hyperbole as a sentence or saying surmounting the truth. Hyperboles are not the sober, vivid stuff of literary genius, but crass inflations of half-baked ideas, like water injected into chicken breast. And Shakespeare's characters generally seem to share this low view of hype, the sense that it goes beyond the bounds of truth, whether factual or artistic. Think of Coriolanus, who resents the adulation of the crowd and their acclamations hyperbolical, or Lord Barone at the end of Love's Labour's Lost, promising to give up the elaborate costumes, to give up the taffeta phrases, silken terms precise, three-piled hyperboles, spruce affectation, figures pedantical. He wants to give up the three-piled hyperboles because these summer flies have blown me full of maggot ostentation. Like the summer fly, hyperbole is short-lived, inappropriate for a writer who was, in Ben Jonson's words, as Samuel has already reminded us with some hesitation, not for our time, but for all time. And indeed, though it is difficult to glimpse Shakespeare's own opinions behind his character's speeches, at those moments where the mask slips and we catch a glimpse of the playwright's own theatrical preferences, he advocates avoiding exaggeration. So in Troilus and Cressida, Ulysses talks derisively about a strutting player who speaks with terms unsquared, which from the tongue of roaring Typhon dropped would seem hyperboles. Typhon is a legendary Greek leviathan, so this actor's speech is so overinflated that even a giant mystical beast could not deliver it convincingly. But it's in Hamlet that we get the clearest sense of how Shakespeare might have wanted this play to be performed and received, perhaps even after his death. Prince Hamlet instructs the players on how to act in the small drama he is putting on for King Claudius. He tells them, "Do not saw the air too much with your hand, thus, but use all gently. For in the very torrent, tempest, and, as I may say, whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness." He tells them to avoid the inexplicable dumb shows and noise which might satisfy the groundlings at the spatial and spiritual bottom of the theatre, but which are not fit for greatness. He tells them, famously, that anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature. It might not be a fashionable word in literary criticism, but as his speech implies, Shakespeare's greatness lies in his truthfulness. His truthfulness not to any single view of the world or of human nature, but, and here I agree with Lara and Dame Marina, to a plurality of voices, a plurality of characters. In Michael Bachtin's term, Shakespeare is great because of his polyphony of voices, none given preeminence over the other. Each voice an incomplete fragment of a humanity which cannot be encompassed by a single idea. Erecting Shakespeare as a towering, unified figure over all this multiplicity leads, like so many erections, only to disappointment. And the plurality of alternative authorship theories that Lara pointed out is evidence of how tyrannical this figure of Shakespeare really is. So that even in the face of so much evidence to the contrary, people are desperate to free the plays from Shakespeare himself. This motion goes further, though, from saying the hype around Shakespeare is an exaggeration. Perhaps this goes without saying, perhaps it's intrinsic to the word. More than that, it says the hype is much ado about nothing. And nothing in Shakespeare has a particular meaning, coming in his character's darkest moments to encompass the entirety of human life. Lear's nothing, nothing, nothing. But as Ben has already pointed out, nothing is a paradoxically productive concept in Shakespeare, perhaps even a procreative one. As I saw someone point out on Twitter when this event was announced, someone delighted by the intrusion of the gynecological into the august pages of the Union Term card. In tonight's motion, quoting the title of the play, Much Ado About Nothing, nothing is a pun on vagina, as in no thing, meaning no penis. So when I say that the hype is much ado about nothing, I do not mean that Shakespeare is bad. I mean that there is a nothingness to the hype, a sense of its being detached from what makes his plays really great. But in the nothingness is also a creative potential, which the hype obscures. By making Shakespeare a national hero, we lose his deep ambivalence about martial nationalist rhetoric, evinced, for instance, in Henry V. And by quoting his lines out of context, as I will admit to doing a couple of times in this speech, we lose Shakespeare's incessant ironizing, the wit that places some of his most memorable lines, like brevity is the soul of wit and to thine own self be true, in the mouth of one of his most clueless, annoying, and excessively talkative characters. The hype around Shakespeare not only distracts us from his contemporaries, as Samuel was saying, but it distracts us from Shakespeare himself. So to indulge for a moment in the exact kind of out-of-context quotation I criticised a moment ago, the hype around Shakespeare is indeed a great deal of sound and fury signifying, and of course, much ado about nothing.
Thank you very, very much, Paul, for your speech. We shall now move on to our final speaker for the night and our fourth speaker for the opposition, Professor Kiernan Ryan. Kiernan is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at Royal Holloway, Emeritus Fellow at Murray Edwards College, and an Honorary Fellow at the Shakespeare Institute. An internationally renowned Shakespeare critic, he has written substantial publications on Shakespeare's tragedies and Shakespeare's last plays. Kiernan, you have our ears.
Thank you, Freddie. Well, I'm happy to begin by granting the motion this much, that Shakespeare has undoubtedly attracted more than his fair share of vacuous bardolatrous guff, but only from those who fail to recognize in the upstart crow the prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come, to quote Sonnet 107. As the poet Robert Graves observed, the remarkable thing about Shakespeare is that he is really very good, in spite of all the people who say he's very good. That there must be something truly remarkable about Shakespeare that sets him apart is beyond dispute. How else can one explain the ever-expanding appeal of his plays over 4 centuries, during which they've fired the imaginations of theatre directors, filmmakers, playwrights, poets, novelists, composers, choreographers, and painters all over the world, while the works of even his greatest fellow dramatists remain museum pieces of abiding interest only to scholars. And what makes the plays truly remarkable, I think, is their dramatization of the way things were in Shakespeare's time from an imaginative standpoint that's still ahead of our time, a standpoint grounded in his drama's commitment to what human beings have in common, as opposed to what divides them. It was already plain to Coleridge 200 years ago that confining Shakespeare's significance to his historical context is to misunderstand him, because, quote, while he registers what is past, he projects the future in a wonderful degree. It is a poor compliment to a poet to tell him that he has only the qualifications of an historian, a remark that adepts of the arid antiquarianism that has stifled Shakespeare's studies for the last 40 years might profit from pondering, as indeed might those in the opposing camp who labor under the reactionary illusion that Shakespeare's enduring appeal springs from his portrayal of the supposedly timeless truths of the universal human condition, which purport to hold good for everyone, regardless of nationality, race, gender, language, creed, or sexual orientation. If there's anything universal about Shakespeare's drama, and I think there is, it's not the plights and fates of his characters, but the egalitarian perspective, the common human standpoint from which they're dramatized by Shakespeare. And to grasp that is to grasp the real reason why the plays have outlived the vanished world they body forth on stage or in the theatre of the mind. Let me be absolutely clear. The fictional worlds of Shakespeare's plays are just as class-divided, misogynistic, racist, and heterosexually biased as the Renaissance reality Shakespeare transmutes into poetic drama. How could they be otherwise? But those worlds are dramatized, structured, and worded in ways that reveal not just the need and the right, but the potential of all human beings to be treated as equals for the simple reason that we belong to the same species. And because that potential equality is never a nebulous abstraction in Shakespeare, but always forged in the heat of compelling dramatic conflict and living dialogue by embodied characters, the prospect of its becoming a reality acquires a credibility it couldn't command if it were merely an abstract contention in a political or philosophical discourse. Take, for example, Shylock's famous searing retort to the Jew-baiting Christians in The Merchant of Venice. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, Do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. Shylock rebukes his tormentors on the grounds that they share the same physiology, faculties, emotions, and needs, which render them equally vulnerable, equally mortal, and equally justified in avenging the wrongs done to them. Shylock's riposte to their racial bigotry invokes a concept of equality that indicts, in effect, every form of inhuman discrimination. The irony, of course, is that Shylock is determined to vindicate the compassionate principles to which he appeals by violating them through revenge. But the physically founded concept of equality Shylock invokes transcends the vindictive purpose for which he enlists it. It propels the vision of the play, as distinct from the viewpoint of the character, far beyond the Elizabethan age in which it was written, making it as much a play for today as a play for 1596. Or take the passionate defense of wives driven to adultery by their husband's ill treatment that Shakespeare gives to Desdemona's maid Emilia, just before Othello enters to murder her mistress for her alleged adultery. But I do think it is their husbands' faults if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us, or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet have we some revenge. Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell and have their palates both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? I think it doth. Is it frailty that thus errs? It is so too. And have not we affections, desires for sport and frailty as men have? Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so. The direct echo of Shylock's speech is unmistakable. Emilia bases her protest at the sexual injustice to which women are subjected by marriage in her patriarchal society on the same irrefutable evidence of physical and emotional affinity that Shylock adduces to upbraid his abusers. Emilia's argument is, of course, the cynical response of a worldly wise wife of her rank conversing informally with her mistress, woman to woman, about the woes of married life in that period. But once again, while the immediate purpose of the character and the cultural context of the speech remain anchored in their historical moment, the enlightened rationale of the speech affords us a view of the matter, in this case, the iniquitous plight of too many women then and now, that points far beyond that moment. In both speeches, how things should and could be is brought to light by a protest against the injustice of the way things are. The capacity of human beings to base their treatment of each other on what unites them is discovered and voiced in response to an intolerable reality. And the whole tragedy of King Lear turns on the conflict between a despotic monarch bound upon a wheel of fire and the thing itself, the unaccommodated, classless human creature within him that survives as pure potentiality within all of us in defiance of everything that divides us. Through the traumatic transformations of Lear, Gloucester and Edgar, the play demolishes the assumptions that support all forms of class society and the unequal distribution of wealth and power on which class society depends. It climaxes in Lear's snarl of contempt for the great image of authority, a dog's obeyed in office. And in place of institutionalized greed, exploitation, and oppression, it advocates a compassionate ethic founded on the kinship of all human beings. So distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough. Nor has the power of King Lear to provoke and inspire its audiences diminished with the passage of time. Absolute monarchs may be a dying breed in the 21st century, but autocratic rulers, as we're only too aware these days, are far from extinct. Systemic social, racial, and sexual injustice thrives. while hunger and poverty exist on a scale beyond even Shakespeare's imagination. We live in a world where the richest 1% of the population owns half the entire world's wealth, and where the accumulated wealth of the 26 richest individuals on the planet is equal to that of the 3.8 billion people who make up the poorest 50%. To such a world, the glovemaker's lad from Stratford, whose supreme tragedy reveals the same poor, bare-forked animal beneath a king's royal robes and a mad beggar's rags, and who already knew 400 years ago why distribution should undo excess and each man have enough, has more to say than ever and has never mattered more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kernan, for your speech and for closing so well our debate this evening. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers, all 8 of our speakers who spoke this evening and gave some very erudite and eloquent speeches, some of which were pieces of theatre in themselves. Just a quick plug for our upcoming events. We have a free couple of days, but we are back on Monday with Rory Stewart being interviewed. That's on the 15th of March at 6 p.m. Then the same day, we have David Baddiel at 7:30, followed by H.R. McMaster and Brendan Sims on the 17th of March at 6 p.m. And then finally, we close the term with our law debate on the motion, "This House believes judges make better law than politicians." Thank you very much to all our audience members who watched. Please just bear in mind you can submit, you can have your say in this debate by submitting your own vote in our poll in the description below, and we'll be announcing the results in a few minutes' time. Good night, everyone, and thank you again.